that one of the songs that Rory likes
Yes,
so
this
much?
is one of Rory's favorite songs. He
Okay.
sang it here once. It was so awesome.
You just wait, you're not going to believe this, but let's see.
Yes, I will believe it.
Rory must be hanging around
Yeah.
there. That's all I'm saying. Death. It's not really a comfortable topic in our culture, right? Not a particularly comfortable one. It's not something we really like to talk about, or even something that we're supposed to talk about, right? There's this taboo about talking about death. In fact, most of us pretend that death isn't really there. As if somehow by not thinking about it or talking about it, we can actually keep it at bay. The modern Western medical approach to death and dying is almost exclusively concerned with prolonging life at all costs, or prolonging life for as long as possible by all means, even at the cost of quality of that life. It's as if we think that we can somehow beat the odds and prevent death. Even the language that we use around when someone is ill, we talk about how they battled cancer, or they won their battle, or they so bravely fought with that illness that they had. Our whole culture has this resistance to talking about death and even thinking about it, this avoidance of death, rather than an acceptance of death as a part of life. So most of us go along each day as if we will never die, right? But the truth is, we will all die. There, I said it. We know this, but we ignore it most of the time. So I'm taking this opportunity of Days of the Dead to broach this subject in a more comprehensive way this year. We kicked off last week with a workshop after the service about advanced care planning. How many people were at that? I think it was really valuable. We learned some really valuable information, but I think it was also, she got us really thinking about some important things. And I think that was really good. And then we'll have the estate planning one coming up in a few weeks. And we're going to be spending these 3 or 4 weeks talking about how we can get more comfortable thinking and talking about death. How becoming aware of our own inevitable death and accepting and embracing death can actually bring a lot of benefits. And we're going to be talking a little bit about Day of the Dead and with the class after the service, and how this ancient, actually I found out thousands of years old tradition of celebrating Day of the Dead has shaped the Mexican, I guess you could say the whole Central American, South American, Latin American perspective on death, although I only speak to Mexican because that's the one that I'm familiar with. So we'll be using Day of the Dead as a backdrop for looking at how our culture views death and juxtaposing that with how other cultures view death, and seeing if that can help us take maybe a little bit different of a perspective, perhaps adopt a more open and receptive approach to death and dying. So today I'm going to talk about 2 people who, because of their unique circumstances, spent their lives more acutely aware of the imminence of their own death than most of us do, and the impact that this had on their lives. Are you seeing the picture? Frida? Yeah. So I'm going to talk about Frida Kahlo. How many people know who Frida Kahlo is? Just so I have some. Oh, wow, look at you guys. Frida Kahlo experts. Okay. So Frida was born in 1907 in Coyoacan, which is just outside of Mexico City. And 1907 was 3 years before the Mexican Revolution began in 1910. Just to give you a context there. Her father was a German immigrant. That's where she got the last name Kahlo, which is obviously not a Mexican name. And her mother was half Native Mexican and half Spanish. So Frida's life was impacted at a very young age because she contracted polio. This was when we still had polio around, right? At least in Mexico. And so at age 6, she got polio and she was bedridden for 9 months. Now, can you imagine a 6-year-old? Who has a 6-year-old being in bed for 9 months? Think about that. And she eventually recovered from the polio, but she always had one leg that was thinner and weaker than the other, and she always walked with a limp. So because of her illness, she had to stay inside a lot because they didn't want to infect other children. And so all of that time she spent inside, she developed this amazing imagination, which would pan out later in her life. That was how she coped, was by, the inner world. Well, she eventually recovered from polio, and she was actually a very active young person. She played sports and such, and she ended up attending the National Preparatory High School in Mexico City, which was the best high school in Mexico City at that time. And she originally wanted to be a doctor. Well, at this National Preparatory School, she met Diego Rivera. And if you don't know, he's one of Mexico's most prominent painters. So Diego was working on a mural at the school when Frida was attending there, and she saw him up on the scaffolding, and she went and talked to him. She was a very brazen young woman. And she went and talked to him, and she admired his painting, and she would watch him paint and stuff. So that's how that relationship sort of began. So this is all happening at this point in the mid-1920s, which was a time of huge cultural renaissance in Mexico. So the revolution had happened, and Mexicans were building a new society, and there was a renewed pride in all things Mexican. That Mexicanness, the native traditions, and folk art and such. And so in this milieu, Frida ran with a very intellectual crowd. She hung out with writers and poets and painters, and all of these young people were very interested in politics. And in fact, some of them went on to actually have quite a role in shaping the new Mexican society after the revolution. When Frida was 18 years old, she was riding on a bus, and it was hit by a streetcar. And in this accident, the metal handrail from the streetcar impaled her body. And so after the accident, all these things are happening, and she's lying there bleeding, and a stranger came up to her and thought this was the best thing to do, and pulled the handrail out of her body as she lay there screaming. She ended up with fractures all over her body, her spine, ribs, collarbone, pelvis, right leg. Her foot was crushed. She was hospitalized for a month in a full body cast. And when she was in the hospital, she had to lie in this box-like structure that looked like a coffin so that she would stay immobile. She graduated from there to a plaster corset cast, so, the whole torso up to the neck. And she had to be flat on her back and immobile for 3 months. So during that time that she was bedridden, Frida began painting. Her father, who was a photographer, really encouraged this painting, and he actually built an easel over her bed so that she could paint while lying on her back. Did you see that one? Is it the next one? And so she would lie, she was lying on her back painting, and she put a little mirror on her bed frame so that she could see herself, and she began painting self-portraits. People always say, well, all she did was paint herself. She did paint a lot of other things, but she painted herself a lot. She was lying on her back, bedridden, and she was looking at herself in a mirror. And so that's how she started painting self-portraits. So she spent 2 years recovering from this accident, and she ultimately did walk again, but she always had health problems and was never, in great health. Well, she continued painting. And then, like I said, she was a brazen young woman. All the best women are. No. She took 4 of her best paintings, she took them to Diego, who was working on a mural. Can you imagine the guts it would take to take your paintings to one of the best muralists in Mexico? So she did, and he was intrigued, and he liked her paintings. And he said that he wanted to come to her house and see more of her paintings. And so he did, and they began a courtship. He was quite a bit older than her. Their love story has got to be one of the most dramatic, famous love stories of the 20th century. And even more romantic because it's set against the backdrop of this post-revolutionary Mexico, this time of great political change and cultural renaissance. So over the subsequent years, she endured endless painful operations, painful corsets. She had 35 total operations. Can you imagine? They basically kept trying to put her back together. And she was bedbound, off and on for periods. So she was in a lot of pain, and she had a need to document that pain. And so that's why she put her life on the canvas. She was a faithful celebrant of Day of the Dead, and like many traditional Mexican people, was very interested in death and Day of the Dead, and she frequently depicted death in her paintings. Her closeness to death, she probably should have died. First she gets hit, then the guy pulls the thing out. I mean, it's a wonder she lived. So she was very close to death, and then every operation, right, was, the possibility of dying again. So that closeness of death in her life, the endless operations, death always at her door. She said to one of her friends, "Death dances around my bed at night." It gave her life an immediacy, an aliveness that is very apparent in her paintings. So she had a reverence for death, and she painted death a lot. She spent a lot of time thinking about her own death, like you would if you were bedridden. But she also painted life. And she really embraced that Mexican perspective of honoring the dead in a celebratory rather than a somber way. So Frida truly embraced life. Has anyone seen the movie about her? It's pretty true to fact. So part of Frida's attraction was that she was just this vibrant, full of life person, very passionate. She had a lot of pets. She liked to throw parties for her friends, and she dressed in this colorful native dress, which was not the thing to do in the bourgeoisie at that time, right? But she loved wearing the native dress and lots of native jewelry, and she loved to eat and drink. And so throughout her paintings, you see these themes of fertility and birth, life, animals, fruits, lush plants, the sun, the moon, and also the ever-present specter of death. So I don't know if any of you are art people, but at that time they tried to peg her as a surrealist, and she was actually friends with Picasso. But she said that she was not a surrealist. She said, "I paint my own reality." For her, the reality was that ever-present specter of death. And so both vibrant life and intimate death are represented in her paintings. And they show that balance between life and death. During her marriage and divorce and remarriage, because the Riveras divorced and remarried, the Riveras traveled to San Francisco. A lot of people don't know that. I don't think any of his murals still exist in San Francisco. They also traveled to New York, where Diego had been commissioned by Nelson Rockefeller to paint some public murals. There's a whole other controversy about that I don't have time to go into. But it's really interesting. Frida was very cheeky. She liked these one-liners, and she said, "I had 2 accidents in my life. The first one was the streetcar, and the second one was Diego." And throughout their marriage, she had many, many miscarriages. She was never able to bring to term a baby. And so that played into her art as well, and her preoccupation with both fertility and death. Well, she ended up having quite a lot of success in her life and had solo exhibitions in both New York and Paris. Has anyone ever seen her paintings? I was able to see some of them at the Met in New York and some in her house in Coyoacán. Beautiful, amazing work. So this person who spent her whole life dancing with death left us with some of the most alive, vibrant, evocative art of the 20th century. And a life story that has inspired thousands of people, especially women. She became a feminist icon, back, 30, 40 years ago. I first learned about her when I was a freshman in Intro to Feminist Studies at UC Santa Cruz. And I'd never heard of her, but I became obsessed with her, and I actually did my senior thesis on her in college. So Frida's life shows how living with that awareness of our own mortality can sometimes help us to live more fully, to embrace life more fully and more passionately. Rory Elder, Vicky's late husband, was also a person who was deeply impacted by his brush with death and by the constant presence of the possibility of death in his life, beginning when he was diagnosed with cancer at age 32. Oh, I wanted to show you. So if you haven't, there's a book that Rory and Vicky wrote together called Life on the Line, which tells his story. But the gist of it is that his diagnosis, his cancer diagnosis, ended up being a catalyst for really deep personal exploration and self-inquiry, and set him on a spiritual path, basically. And he spent a lot of time trying to heal both his mind and his body. Heal his body so that he could live, but heal his mind so that life would be worth living. Right? And even though he beat cancer, at least the first time around, he always lived with an understanding of his own mortality that most of us don't, who haven't experienced that. And I think it's safe to say that Rory would not have become a minister had it not been for that experience. So, if we're not facing an illness like that, it's easy for us to forget that we are all going to die. And to spend most of our life avoiding thinking or talking about death, especially in a culture that supports that. But thinking about our own death gives us an opportunity to more fully embrace the life that we are living. It gives us an opportunity to ask ourselves, what is it that I value in life? What do I want my life to be about? What do I want my life to be about? And what is most important to me? You know, we just finished this book, Eye of the Storms, Reverend Dr. Gary Simmons. And he talks about a process that he started doing nightly, where he would ask himself, if I were going to die tomorrow, right? Can you imagine every night before bed? If I were going to die tomorrow. And then a series of questions. What unfinished business would I take care of? Who would I need to make amends to? Where do I need to set things right? What things would I do that I've been putting off? How would I live today if I knew that I was going to die tomorrow? A few months ago, we hosted a climate lecture here at the church. And we were given some pretty grim statistics. And I know a lot of us felt pretty overwhelmed by what we heard, maybe even paralyzed. Well, a lot of people left after the lecture portion, but some of us stayed around. The brave diehards. We stayed around to have a conversation, and what we ended up having was this really rich conversation. So basically saying, okay, let's just say this is all true, and we got like another 10 to 15 years on this planet. I'm just saying for the sake of argument. What are we going to do with that? What are we going to do with that fact? What if it is true? Let's hope it's not, but what if it is true? How are we going to live now? How are we going to value each and every moment of our life? Just like Frida and like Rory, having that knowledge that our own death is imminent, because it really is imminent. From the day we're born, our own death is imminent, right? Whether we live a year or 100 years. How are we going to focus on what's important in our life and remembering to love one another, to tell our loved ones and friends that we love them and what they mean to us, to not waste a single precious moment of this life? Having those grim statistics and that idea that we may have a time limit on this thing here helped us to really value our life and try to think about how we can make some good come of this. Just like we always try to do in Unity. It's not to say that everything is good, but how can we make it for good? And so that possibility of death can serve to wake us up before we waste another single moment of our precious life. In Unity, the way we approach death is we say that nothing perishes, only changes form. Life does not begin with birth nor end with death. It's a cycle, and death is a transition, a doorway or a passageway, if you will, to a new realm. We don't know what it looks like, but we know it's a different realm, a different dimension. We could even say that death is a change in perspective. So we look at death, or we try to look at death as not an ending, but as a new beginning. And that can help us to not fear death so much. So the Buddhists have a practice called Maranasati, and this is mindfulness of death. Leave it to those Buddhists, right? But they do, and so they ponder their own death, and this teaches them to remember the impermanence of all things, including our lives. Everything comes to pass. So I was asking my mom about this last night. My mom is a Buddhist, and she said that they are taught to practice as if death is sitting on their left shoulder. I thought that was really interesting. So always being aware. So the Buddhists say that something is born and something dies. Something dies because it was born, and so it's a cycle. And by awakening to the truth of our own mortality, not pushing it away, not ignoring it like it's not there, we can learn to live more mindfully. If we can become aware and remember that fleeting nature of life, we can be sure not to waste our lives. And so this realization about this mindfulness of death practice helped me think about Day of the Dead in a different way. So it's a lot more than just sugar skulls, and the sugar skulls are everywhere now, and I love them as much as anyone, but there's a very deep meaning to it. Contemplating the truth of our own mortality and those of our loved ones can help us to awaken more fully to our own lives. And so I invite you to stay after the service if you are able and learn more about Day of the Dead. We've embraced that practice in this community for about 5 or 6 years now. And I think it's a really beautiful way of both remembering our loved ones, but also trying to broaden our perspective on death. And for Mexicans, Day of the Dead is not a somber occasion. Have you seen the parades and the music and the dancing? Mexican style, vibrant, lots of music and color and food and drink and humor. It's one of the ways that they approach death that is very helpful to them. The skull with your name on it is meant to be ironic, or mocking of death. And so Day of the Dead is not just a memorial or a recognition of the dead, but truly a celebration of life. Two sides of the same coin, right? And it teaches us a reverence for death, that it's not to be ignored, but to be honored. And so, with this perspective of humor and everything, we can learn to laugh at death, to dance with death, to embrace death. As Frida and Rory both had to because of their lives, we may not have to, but we can. We have that opportunity to embrace that. So I'd like to just leave you with the words of Frida Kahlo. Remember that every tick-tock is a second of life that goes by and doesn't repeat itself. There's in it so much intensity, so much interest, that there is only the problem of how to live it. May each person solve it as best they can. So may you solve it as best you can.
We are
allow your breathing to become more slow and deep to help you become present in this now moment. Each day is a gift from God. Tomorrow is promised to no one. The fact that we awake to a new day is testimony to God's grace, granting us the opportunity for healing and reconciliation. Imagine that today might be your last day on earth. In your sleep this evening, the Holy Spirit appears to you and offers you a chance to leave this world free of any obligation or regret. In an instant, you begin to review your life and each moment of fear, jealousy, greed, condemnation, dishonesty, prejudice, complacency, and arrogance you have ever felt. You're able to see the consequences of not being connected to your wholeness and worth. Both the pain you have caused and the pain you have experienced. That still small voice says to you, can you see that no one has ever been against you? Can you see that your fear and loneliness have been wrought in sheer ignorance of your true self? Are you willing to forgive those who have harmed you in any way? Realizing that you could only have been hurt because you were not connected to your own wholeness and truth and worth. Are you willing to ask for forgiveness and make amends to one and all? Maybe you begin to long for the possibility to make things right, to be given a chance to choose again, to take a higher path. You might want to try this practice that Dr. Gary talks about of making a list of people that you need to set things right with. And resolve to amend those relationships. What unfinished business awaits you? Where were you too quick to judge or too busy to be really present? Where have you squandered even one precious moment of this life? Where have you failed to focus on what is important to you? And resolve now that even if tomorrow may not be the last day of your life, we can choose to live with that death sitting on our left shoulder, constantly reminding us of the fleeting nature and the preciousness of life. Resolve to make the changes you need to make your life be about what you want it to be, what matters most to you. To give and receive love. To be that presence of God wherever it is needed. To truly live each day from your highest self. And so I invite you now to just rest for a few moments gently in the silence. So I invite you now to gently return to this time and place, knowing that you are holy, 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 and you are whole. And so we say, thank you, God.
Thank you.
And so it is.